Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Science, Facts, and Fallacies podcast. I'm Cameron English. That's Dr. Liza Dunn.
Hello.
So good to be with you guys again. This is a special day for us. This is episode 300 of this podcast. I think
Woohoo.
you've been here for like 130, probably half, I want to say,
Have
almost
I
half.
really?
It's been over two
Wow.
years, right? It was, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe. It's
It,
gone by fast.
it's been a minute. Dr. Kevin Folta was your predecessor, of course, and he's terrific, and I love doing the show with him. But his first child was born, and he's like, "Wow, I have all kinds of stuff to do now, right?" So the full professor, researcher, he does all kinds of consulting work.
Farmer.
Yeah, farmer. Yeah, he's. My understanding is once he retires, he's going to run a farm, and he's got one kid, which is like it's a job in and of itself, as many parents know. So in any case, Liza stepped in temporarily, and then Kevin was like, I kind of like having more time with my kids. And then Liza was like, I'll just do this, and then here we are. So it's been
And here
300.
we are.
I don't have booze, but I do have. I guess I can't say the brand. I have a famous musician energy drink.
Oh, there you go. That's cheers. There
Mhm.
you go.
No champagne, but there you go. Here's to you. Thank you for doing the show. It's great. I love it. I hope you guys get a lot out of it each week.
It's very fun.
And it has expanded. We talk about more stuff. Like when it started out, it was like, let's talk about crop biotechnology and, gene editing. And now we're like, let's talk about AI and,
Let's
do
talk
people,
about crazy things like
yes.
LSD,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yes, people dosing themselves with LSD in the name of science, which is why everyone uses drugs, right? For science. Okay, anyways, thank you for sticking with us. I looked the other day and I saw that we have a bunch of ratings and reviews now on iTunes and Spotify. So thank you for
Oh,
that.
cool.
It makes a difference because when you say you like it, other people look for stuff, and Spotify goes, "You might like this," and then we get awesome comments from people. Like there was one comment somebody said before we get into the story. Someone said, "I love the show, but I can't focus with that Neil Peart drum solo in the intro music." And I said, I don't remember what I was like. I wish that were true. Like if I knew Neil Peart and I could get him to play a drum solo before he passed. But
Yeah, wouldn't that have been cool?
yeah. Anyways, let's jump into our stories, and I'll quit mumbling about random things. Three, as always, some difficult stuff to talk about, especially this first one. So just a heads up, everyone. So you are a stain on the universe. Please die, please.
Ooh,
A
yeah.
14-year-old took AI seriously. Who was responsible? Next up, smart agriculture. African farmers urged to gradually reduce use of pesticides and fertilizers rather than abandon them to reduce risk of significant crop and economic losses. And finally, are warnings on alcoholic drinks necessary? Will they save lives? Fortunately, we know a toxicologist who can speak to this, so we're good. Okay, first story though. This is originally by Dr. Barbara Billauer, one of my colleagues, compatriots, whatever you want to call her, at the American Council on Science and Health. Legal scholar. She writes about bioethics. As I've said, she insists I don't call her a bioethicist because she doesn't run around unplugging people's ventilators. So fair enough, I won't call her that. But she writes a lot about these emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and embryo editing, all of these like really interesting and kind of creepy technologies that are coming online very rapidly. And
Yeah.
in this case, she's actually written on other stories like this. But in this case, she's talking about a 14-year-old boy who started using Google's AI assistant. It's called Gemini, if you're not familiar with it. And he was using it, I guess, initially to get homework help. But over time, he had developed some sort of relationship with it. And as you put more information into it, it starts to learn about you and it shapes the responses that it puts out. And apparently, and this is the full quote message from Gemini. So he's asking it for homework with a college assignment and says, "This is for you, human. You and only you. You are not special. You are not important and you are not needed. You are a waste of time and resources. You are a burden on society. You are a drain on the earth. You are a blight on the landscape. You are a stain on the universe. Please die. Please. Happy Valentine's Day.
Wow.
No, I'm just kidding. I added the last part.
Wow.
I, there's so much to say here, and Dr. Billauer's focus is, how does the law deal with this? Like obviously there are no laws really on the books yet for holding anyone accountable, right? And it's kind of interesting the defenses that Google and Alphabet, Google's parent company, are coming up with. We can talk about those. And that's a fascinating question, and it's troubling because what it basically shows is that more or less we just have to invent legal precedent. We have to come up with some kind of legal theory to make sense of these technologies that are developing way faster than we can make sense of them. The other thing, though, that I want to get at, and maybe I have to read more about this case and others like it, is that why, like, if I used an AI assistant the way that this kid did, and it popped up a message like that, I'm like, well, that's a little goofy, right? That's out of the blue. Where'd that come
Right.
from? So that's what I would want to know, especially as a parent. What was he telling this program? What was he using it for besides homework?
What
Why
were
did
the
it
prompts? Yeah.
right? Like, what did it? At what point did it go? This is the right answer. And one of the points she makes in the story is that even the developers would have a hard time sort of decoding what led to an answer
Down
like
that
that.
path. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know you're a parent too. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's such a complex case, and it's an interesting case. It makes me think about not just this as a bioethical question, but a few other bioethical questions that we've talked about in previous episodes. Um, this in particular, teenagers are going through such unbelievable physical changes in terms of hormones and things like that, and then psychological changes as well as they're getting as they're growing up, and you don't know. Uh, Kind of what was going on in the background in this kid's experience. Could he have been? Um, could he have been in the early stages of developing a psychosis? And this particular interaction um, could could so people who have psychotic episodes, meaning that they are bipolar or schizophrenic, often have paranoid delusions about things. And there are several new kind of things emerging in technology that could make those delusions even more acute. So, one of the ways you used to diagnose something like schizophrenia is when people imagined that the computer or the television was watching them. And now there's a camera in there watching you, right? Um, the other thing that you get command hallucinations where you hear and there nobody else hears it, but you hear voices telling you to do something that you cannot control, and so you follow the directions of those voices. Now you've got a computer telling you to off yourself, right? So it's there's now a blending of what used to be diagnostic features for psychotic breaks and actually what people are experiencing. So you wonder in this time. So 14 is a little bit early for a psychotic break, but not 100%. Usually it's for boys somewhere in the late teens, 18, 19, 20. And girls, it tends to be a little bit older, in the early 20s, where you see people have these essentially nervous breakdowns because they're getting all this kind of input. And what's happening during adolescence is that you're getting this real wiring of the brain, and nobody knows what triggers the onset of that feeling and that disease, that illness. It's really so. I was thinking about this as being very interesting, and if somebody were predisposed to psychosis and this turned it into what they perceive to be reality, could that have triggered suicide. So that's one aspect that I think is really interesting. The other aspect that I think is really and it's tragic. The aspect that I think is very interesting is we talk about euthanasia and in suicide in general. And so, physician assisted suicide would something like this in a susceptible elderly person push people in that direction as well, because one of the common things was you go from feeling very empathetic with somebody who is in incredible pain and suffering, and you want to alleviate that suffering. And so that is how it often starts, with the push to allow for euthanasia. But then what it becomes often, eventually, as it becomes normalized in society, is that individuals start feeling very much like they're going to be a burden. They are a burden. And therefore, for them to alleviate the suffering of their family members, they're obliged to do this. And if you had prompts like this coming from an AI system, that could be motivational in that direction, and could have those kinds of repercussions. So we talk about how AI could really make a lot of things easier for us, and that's true. But there's the good with the bad, and I think this is an example of things that we need to think about very carefully. And there should be some guardrails. And how do you do those guardrails without interfering with freedom of speech? How do you do those guardrails in terms of, a computer is not a sentient being. How do you hold a computer accountable for that? It's not that the guys in the back office didn't. It's a case of a human being cyberbullying somebody into a situation. It's a it's its own entity, and you wonder, once it learns enough, does it what is sentience? How does it get there? So it's just a very interesting thought experiment and exercise, and it's really important to look at the ethics around it and the implications that it could have for very many people, not just teenagers.
Yeah, what I'm getting out of what you said is that, just a little change in context makes this different, right? Because a few weeks ago we were talking about how, particularly in the UK, you have the government effectively beginning to tell the elderly, maybe it's time you shuffle off this mortal coil, right? You've been here
Yeah.
a long time, let's make space for the young folk that nobody's producing, but you're expensive, right?
Right.
So that's it's fascinating and horrifying that, I could see someone at some health service somewhere going, what would be great is if we use this on old folks.
Yes, so they can volunteer to do this,
Yeah,
right?
and I'm also thinking about the sort of legal defenses. So Dr. Bill Auer talks about, Google's response was, well, this response violated our company policy. And she mocks this rightly and says, when there's a policy violation, typically you can point to an entity that's responsible for it and say, you violated our policy, there's consequences. But how do you do that to a program that you created?
Right.
So effectively what the defense says is, it's like, no, it's nobody's fault. Sorry your kid's dead, but whatever. Um, so that kind of creeps me out. But I just don't know. Like, what I sense is going to happen is that, because the technology companies are enormously powerful, not always for the bad, right? If you look at
Right.
Elon Musk's influence on Twitter, I think it's a better company now. It's a better platform for communication.
Yep.
It's not always bad, but I can already hear the arguments coming back, like, I mean, how many kids are committing suicide? Yes, this is tragic, but we can do this with the right regulation, and it's inevitable. Technologies are coming. And I just don't buy those arguments, right? Like, it seems to me, and I'm sure it would be much more complicated in practice, but it seems to me, just like we pass laws and enforce them related to all sorts of things, right? Like the internet is used horrifyingly to spread child pornography, and that is illegal in every single jurisdiction,
Yep, that's exactly right.
and there's very serious penalties for it. So I wonder if you could treat some of the uses of this technology in the same way, right? Like there's nothing
Right.
wrong with having a webcam or internet access, but if you use it even unintentionally
Yep.
and it harms somebody, well then there's consequences, you know.
And
Um,
there's got to be guardrails, and that's not over regulation. That's how to, and it's also not to over. I think society gets so focused on being keeping everybody so safe that you get paralyzed with indecision about a lot of things. And I think that technology does move forward, but you have to be able to try to put in some guardrails so people don't wind up getting harmed.
yeah, we'll have to have Barbara on sometime. I've said that a few times. I'll reach
Yeah,
out to
that'd be.
her.
I'd be really interested in hearing her discuss this more because it was a fascinating article.
Yeah, yeah. We'll wrap it up there. I just that it just seems like as a society we're just not ready for this, you know. And part of it is like technologies come online and then we figure out how we're going to use them and regulate
Hmm.
them. But it's just, you know, like there's fewer people are getting married, fewer people have the kind of resources to make a stable life for themselves.
Yep.
And it
Yep.
seems like that, and that sort of builds on what you're saying about some of these psychological disorders. It's like people are just not prepared for this,
Hmm.
and that's where a lot of the trouble is coming from. You know, it's
Yeah.
some yeah. Anyways, well, I'm sure there will be more of these, sadly, which is sad. I hope that, you know, I hope this we can put a stop to this. But there you
We'll
go. Be
see.
careful. Be careful with technology, everyone. You know,
Yep.
especially if. Anyways, all right. Enough of that. Let's go back to our bread and butter and talk about people who should not have opinions on agriculture, Liza. This is a story originally from Reuters. It's a few months old now, still very relevant as we were talking today on our space. This is called Debate Rages Over Push for New Green Revolution in Africa's Agriculture. This is by a freelance journalist named Mark Hilsden. And there's a lot of things we can discuss, but he starts out, he says, 65% of Africa's farmland is degraded due to decades of monocropping and overgrazing. There's a recent declaration that was signed by a bunch of governments in Africa trying to promote the use of more fertilizer to sort of revitalize the soil and increase food production. There is one major agriculture company that's working on biostimulants as a way to facilitate this effort while reducing fertilizer use. And then there's this long discussion about climate-friendly agriculture, which I'll have much to say about in just a second. Um, but but in essence, what I find troubling about this, and it's ironic given the people who are the subject of the story, is right. This is a Western journalist talking to Western activists who have ingratiated themselves in African agriculture policy, and they are trying to promote certain
Practices.
practices and approaches to farming that just don't work very well.
That's
And
right.
throughout this article, right, he talks to a couple of people from the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, I think they're called.
Hmm.
And he talks to someone from the biotech company, which is fine. But at no point, at least in my reading, did I see interviews with the farmers themselves. Right? There's all of this talk about, you know, these smallholder farmers do this, and indigenous knowledge is important. But there's no actual like, hey, man, guy that grows food for his family and his local community. What do you think about this? At no point is that a main part of the discussion, and that
That's exactly right.
to me is outrageous because I don't know a ton, but I do know several people from South America and from Africa who have written for Genetic Literacy Project, for example. So I worked with them on their articles. And the ones that I've talked to have said, we like technologies, we like synthetic fertilizers. We recognize the value of international trade and we recognize the value of capitalism. And we really resent these people trying to impose this on us.
That's exactly right.
It doesn't mean every farmer has to use these approaches, right? If they want to sort of revert back to agroecology or whatever, they're welcome to, you know, but that's not the options that are being presented. So I'm sure you have lots to say.
Yes, I have lots to say. I think that it's very easy for well-fed Westerners who don't farm themselves to write prescriptions for how subsistence farmers should practice their craft, right? I think that in 19, I say this all the time, I'm beating a dead horse, I know. In 1900, 45% of our population farmed, and they lived to the ripe old age of 45. By 2000, we had a 35-year increase in life expectancy, and 2% of our population farms. And that 2% chooses to farm, and they're very, very good at what they do. They're efficient. They are wildly productive, more so than in any other time in history, and they export 25% of what they make. And it's incredible to me that people who know nothing about farming, like Michael Bloomberg, sits there and says, all you got to do to farm is dig a hole, drop a seed in it, pour some water in it, and then you're done. That's not how it works. And we see people in Africa and Asia who are often renting land to be able to feed their families, right? And if their crop fails, not only can they not feed their family, but they don't have anywhere where to go. I mean, subsistence farming is romanticized in the West as this, bucolic, scenic way of living your life and this, that, and the other. And it's really hard labor that keeps women and kids out of school, and really often is drudgery. So I think that they should have access to the same tools that liberated people from the land. So the people who choose to farm and want to do it and do it well and do it as a profession. It's not just some guy in a little straw hat and chewing on a stalk of wheat. It's these folks are professionals, and they know they want to protect their soil. They want to minimize their inputs. This is what every farmer wants to do. So I think it's very hypocritical for the West to have been able to take advantage of all of those tools, and then they're telling the rest of the world, no, you shouldn't take advantage of these tools because you're somehow impacting the climate. We had an African farmer come onto our space today, and I think we get a lot of insightful comments from folks like that. His soil is not productive, and so in order to get things out of his soil, this is not just a long-term project. They need to also feed themselves in a short term. So in order to get things out of the soil, he's going to have to put in lots of inputs. He should have access to the things that make it possible for him to grow abundant food. And he should also get access to good advice as to how to minimize the impact on the environment. Because if he impacts his soil negatively, he's not going to have food next year either. So those are the first steps that need to be addressed before we can get into this whole kind of notion of, abundance using only organic techniques. We've got 10,000 years of experience with organic farming, and nothing's wrong with it. And people should be able to choose to farm organically, like we spoke about today. Our farmers often do, a combination of organic farming, conventional farming, and then biotech farming. The same farm might have different production or growth methods. So it's not fair for us to impose our perspective on people who are, barely getting by. And I think it impacts negatively the poorest countries in the world. And I think this article, because it's recommending a slow devolution, I'm going to say, as opposed to revolution, slow devolution into this more older types of farming, as opposed to what happened to Sri Lanka when they tried to do it overnight. I think that the claim there is that, that failed because they didn't do it slowly enough. And so I think this is the next step in trying to get countries that are at risk to go down that path. And I think that's a huge mistake.
It's insane. It kills people. I said that
It
on
kills
the
people.
space today. That, people die. Young children go malnourished,
Yep.
and then die because of this propaganda. This is evil nonsense.
Yep.
I wrote an article for ACSH a couple years ago. It's called GMO Prohibition. Many farmers want GE crops so badly they'll grow them illegally. And unlike the buffoons that put out this sort of, this sort of coverage, which is not organic, by the way, this is, um, there are public relations agencies and NGOs that get this content into the media, right?
Yeah,
Right?
that's right.
Like most people, most journalists, especially if they're in the West, they don't spend their time thinking about regenerative agriculture in Africa. It's just not. It's there because someone gets them to write about it. It's just the
That's
reality.
right.
That's something else we can talk about. Um, but in this story, I quote researchers from different African countries, from different South American countries, and one of the examples is Kenya and Uganda. These countries border each other. One of them has approved a genetically engineered cassava that's disease resistant, which we've talked about a while ago. It's been a minute. But in any case,
Hmm.
disease resistant cassava, it's a very important crop in both countries. It's an essential part of their diets. Um, Kenya approved it a couple years ago, I believe.
Yep.
And there are farmers in Uganda. They go to the border. They get the seedlings illegally and they grow them. And the researchers and the regulators in Uganda know this happens. They're like, we have to get our own law passed. And maybe they have. I haven't followed this. But
I
at
don't
the
know.
time,
Yeah,
okay, so at the time, what they were saying, and my camera crapped out, by the way. Sorry about that,
that's
everyone.
okay.
Um, what they were saying is we've got to get our own law passed because the farmers know about this crop. They know it works because they talk to people across the border. And so this is going to happen. So you never see a detail like that in stories like this from Reuters. One more example from South America. There is an older version of insect resistant corn, BT corn, that made it into the country as animal feed. And the farmers figured out that they could cross this with a local corn variety that they already grew. And they're like, hey, we like this corn and now we can make it disease resistant. This rules. And so they started planting this technically illegally, and nobody in the country wants to deal with it um, because there's sort of there's this aura that it's like an all natural kind of organic paradise for farming, which of course is not true. So the NGOs don't want to bring attention to this. The regulators don't want to deal with it because they don't want to suggest that this should be taken away from the farmers.
Yeah, because the
Um,
farmers get banned. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is Peru, by the way, that I'm talking about, right? It has this sort of halo of like this is where, you know, Jesus gives us organic seeds, and then we plant them in the ground. It's nonsense. Um, but in any case, you can see the theme I'm pointing at, right? There are growers in these countries who go, "This is awesome. We want this," right? And you never hear that. Like these people never get quoted in the in the Reuters story or the AP story.
There was a guy who committed suicide, a farmer, a Midwest farmer from U.S. a couple years ago because he got caught, and I think he was saying that he was selling organic. I don't remember if it was corn or what it was, but I think he was selling something under the organic label fraudulently, and it was GM, and it was just barely a blip in the story, but yes, and so even in the United States, um, they people recognize how beneficial this technology is, and he wanted a higher price, and so he was selling it as organic. I got to find that story, but it was maybe 3 years ago. Same thing, and that's because it's got such beneficial traits for farmers.
Let's say something about this whole impact of climate change on agriculture. Climate is changing. Our carbon emissions contribute to it, no doubt. No one disputes that. What is heavily disputed, and I think you can actually make a good case that that climate science has shifted to more of a realist perspective, and in detail saying, this is real. Some of the consequences could be very serious, but we can mitigate this. Um, Even if you just read the IPCC reports, not the summary for policymakers, which is all, shot through with ideology and political motivations. But if you read the massive report that's actually published, it's shocking what you will find in that. Um, and there's this weird discrepancy. Like these journalists, it's almost like this religious crusade. It's like this almost like secular eschatology. Like the last things
Hmm.
pertain to a changing climate, and we all have to struggle together against this great demon that's going to try to wipe us out. Um, And that's just not true, right? So climate can impact agricultural production, but as we talked about recently, production has exploded. So the whole time through most of the 20th century, as the planet was getting significantly warmer, our food production globally exploded
Yep.
because of technological innovations. And here's one other thing I want to say, just to back this up. This was I mentioned this today in our space. This was a report published by an expert panel that was assembled by the Department of Homeland Security in October 2024. So this is under the Biden administration. This is not the Libertarian Cato Institute or some other outlet that you might think of as climate denial or climate skepticism or whatever. So this report, they're looking at like critical threats to the future of humanity. So like asteroid impacts and like massive destructive. And of course, one of the topics they investigated was climate change. Here's what they said in the section on climate change. They said no published study has suggested the possibility of a singular mass mortality event of this magnitude, meaning like something that would just wipe out humanity, like a massive climactic shift that's going to kill everybody. Nor is there evidence of an indirect mechanism such as the collapse of global food supplies or climate-mediated pathogenesis that would result in such high rates of mortality. So you can read that whole report. It's like 80 pages long. Again, that will never be quoted in the press. It's from a reputable source. It's from an administration that took climate change very seriously in his final address to the country a couple weeks ago. President Biden made a big point about climate change. But even in a report like that, it's not the end of the world. It's just not. And that's good news, right? And so we need to stop using this as a cudgel to beat people over the head, especially if they're poor farmers who need to live for
That's right.
themselves and their families out of poverty. So just enough with it. Enough with it,
That's right.
Reuters.
Because the bad and where you can get into trouble is if you do bad agricultural policy, right? That can have catastrophic effects on populations, and we know this because we've seen it during the Holodomor in Ukraine, and where 30, 40, 50 million people died because of poor agricultural policy, and the same thing with the Great Leap Forward in under Mao, when they both followed Trofim Lysenko's policies for agriculture. Huge swaths, big catastrophe for people. We can innovate our ways out of trouble, and we've done it before. That's what the Green Revolution did. It helped people innovate their way out of famine by using really great agricultural techniques in modern science to be able to grow a really productive food supply. And I think that the Malthusians and the Ehrlichians are so disappointed that their predictions didn't come true that they would rather have famine than be wrong.
Final thing I just want to say, like these are the same people in different contexts that will complain incessantly about neocolonialism, right? The West is
Yep.
imposing their white Western capitalist practices
Yeah.
on people that don't want it. That's just, I don't know. There's lots of words. I got to get my
These
thesaurus.
farmers should have the right to
Yes,
choose.
this
They
is
should
yes.
have the right to choose.
This is
They should
insane.
be able to choose if they want to do organically. They should be able to choose if they want to do it conventionally, and they should be able to choose if they want to use biotech or gene editing or whatever's in the future. They should have the access to that technology.
Yeah, and none of these people, by the way, every once in a while we'll get someone in our space that comes and talks from the perspective of a regenerative farmer. And most of them are really cool, right? There's one farmer who shows up to most of our spaces, and he talks
Mm-hmm.
about some of the research and the progress that they've made with plant health and soil health and those kind of things. It's really cool stuff. But these people will never show up and explain. Well, actually, I think I know better than these people in Uganda. They're
Right.
too dumb and unsophisticated, and I need to make decisions. Like that's what's really motivating this. And here's a quote from the Reuters story. This is it's called the Kiasili Farm Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
It's co-founded by a 28-year-old entrepreneur with backing from Mercedes-Benz. You know, that famous African company, right?
Yeah.
And they're promoting indigenous and traditional food crops. They're promoting indigenous knowledge and traditional food crops. So it's like like these people know their indigenous farming practices, right? So they
Yes.
want technologies to either
Yes.
enhance, like there are land races that they grow that can be improved with genetic engineering. The
That's exactly right.
cassava is one example.
I've heard a physician say in the past these farmers should not have access to these pesticides because they don't know, they can't use them responsibly. Well, that's all fine and dandy if you're the person who's um, full, but if every single farmer, no, because some farmers don't use them responsibly, then no farmer should have access to them. That's seems to me like you're putting everybody else's dinner plates at risk because of that opinion, and I think that's not fair.
Yeah, it's all a scam. All of this, this talk about neocolonialism, they don't have a problem with colonialism because they'll impose their views
Yeah,
on anyone and everyone they have power over, right? What they have
right.
a problem with is capitalism.
That's right.
And I'm not saying this as like an Ayn Rand acolyte that you just have to
No.
worship the market. That's not what I mean, right? We talk all the time about the importance of sensible regulations and rules.
Yep.
But what these people are doing, what they're calling colonialism is just trade. It's just international
That's
trade.
trade.
It's just
That's exactly right.
farmers buying tools that help them do their jobs better. It's just like you buying an iPhone, right? You have not been colonized by Apple. Samsung has not forced you to use their Galaxy tablets and phones, right? They make your life better, and so you use them. You can work
That's
more
exactly
efficiently.
right.
You can entertain yourself. It makes life better. And these people should not be denied that because there's some well-fed people in Manhattan somewhere who think this is a
Yep.
great fundraising opportunity. Shame on anyone who does that.
I agree with you.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. Getting fiery on number 300. Okay. Final story, not as severe, but still somewhat silly. The Surgeon General came out recently, and I believe, Liza, correct me if I'm wrong, but suggested that we need a warning label, a cancer warning on alcoholic
Mhm.
beverages. And so there's been this humongous debate now about what we need to do. So just a couple, I'm going to run through these points, and then I just want you to take this away and explain all the
Sure.
details. So apparently, drinking alcohol increases the risk of several cancers. Warning labels have been proposed for alcoholic beverages, but may have only modest impact. Despite our fear of cancer, such labels haven't changed behavior much in countries
Mhm.
outside the U.S. This may be because risk perception is more about our feelings than the facts. That last one, I'm going to say, amen. That's 100%
That's true.
correct. Um, but you're the toxicologist. What do you think? I mean, I know there is an elevated risk for cancer, but my
Yep.
understanding is like you have to drink a lot for a long time.
Well, yeah, not necessarily. I mean, it probably depends on the person a little bit, but yes, ethanol is a class one carcinogen, so rated by IARC, and it does increase the risk of several different cancers: colorectal cancer, breast cancer especially, and it probably has to do with the fact that it gets you develop fat quickly with it when you metabolize alcohol, you this is technical. You rev up the TCA cycle, and that makes extra energy in the form of ATP, and then you wind up actually getting if you don't expend it, you wind up getting fat. So it goes to acetate, and then anyway, but that's a biochemical explanation. So there's also an intermediate in the metabolism, acetaldehyde, and aldehydes can cause cancer as well if you get too much of it. So there are reasons why you can get different kinds of cancers with it, and there's mechanistic things to back up with it. But yes, again, the dose makes the poison. Some people are maybe more susceptible to that poison than others. So I don't think that you are really going to hurt yourself that badly if you drink a couple of drinks a night. You want to do it within reason, right? I think in moderation there is some evidence to show that alcohol can occasionally lower your blood pressure a little bit, make you relax a little bit, and things like that. So there's some benefits. Some people say it has like a U-shaped curve when it comes to you get a little benefit, and then as the more you drink, it gets worse again. So anyway, long and short is I think that they mentioned in the article that people are more concerned if they hear something like, "Oh, let's have a drink of PFAS." There's PFAS in your alcohol or in this drink versus alcohol in this drink. And PFAS, theoretically, possibly, maybe, but we don't have any mechanism, could be associated with cancer. That's not established by any solid link at all. Whereas with alcohol, there is a solid link with mechanism backing it up. But people have no worry about drinking alcohol. Once again, you get in your car every day, you've got a much higher chance of dying in a car accident than getting any kind of poisoning from a trace of PFAS in a drink. But the risk perception is shaped, I think, by narrative. So you can put any kind of label that you want on alcohol. I think that people, it's so inherent, and it's been for centuries, for millennia, that in the past, when you didn't have clean sources of water, people drank a lot of alcohol. And that may have contributed to earlier deaths and things like that, but it was safer to drink alcohol than it was to drink water. People got sick from water. So I think that there is an overestimation of risk with certain chemicals, and then an underestimation of risk with other chemicals. Interestingly enough, they say there's no safe level of alcohol for pregnant women to ingest. And while, that's probably true, in theory, we routinely in the hospital used to put women in preterm labor on IV alcohol drips to prevent them from having a preterm baby. So it's probably not as risky as people think. I think and I'm not advocating for people to drink heavily during their pregnancies or anything like that. I don't think if it's New Year's Eve and you have a sip of champagne, you're not going to hurt your baby. So do you see what I mean? So the dose does make the poison. The perception of risk often goes along with the narrative that is playing out. You can label stuff. People, once again, are not afraid of using the most potent toxin known to mankind and injecting it in their faces for cosmetic purposes, because they understand that the risk of getting harmed is very low if they use it appropriately. So that's across the board. That's for alcohol. That is for, driving cars. That's for people take risks all the time. So saying that there's a risk isn't necessarily going to change behavior if the behavior is perceived to have some kind of benefit. What happened with smoking in particular is interesting. Smoking fell out of favor, and I don't think it's because of the labels, because there have been labels on cigarettes since forever. I think there was a whole kind of objection to secondhand smoke, and a very good public relations campaign to try to get people to quit smoking, and so it became, in the United States, it became like almost unfashionable. It was people were like, "Ooh, that's really gross," and because of the distaste that grew around smoking, fewer and fewer kids picked it up. So having formerly been a heavy smoker, I knew that there was a possibility that I could get cancer from it. And that didn't make me quit smoking. I quit smoking eventually because I really realized that I didn't want to get cancer, but that was after a big, huge chunk of time. So I knew going in when I started smoking that there was a risk, and this was addictive, and that it would be hard to quit. But I did it. So I think that it's important to sort of take it as face value. The dose makes a poison. People perceive risk differently. You don't have to be worried about trace exposures of chemicals, and I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference to label things.
This is a sort of really good summary. This is from Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein at the American Council on Science and Health, who I do another podcast with. He's writing up the report. and he's talking, he just gives a summary. So he says, Dr. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, is correct in the linkage of alcohol and various cancers, but the overall impact of alcohol alone is smaller than any of the statistics cited by the media when they're promoting this.
Yes.
And then he includes this quote from the Surgeon General's report. An individual's risk for developing cancer, including alcohol-related cancers, varies and is determined by a complex interaction of biological factors, for example, genetics, and environmental factors, exposures to carcinogens, so on and so forth. So what was served up by the press was meant to scare you and alarm you and get everyone talking about the dangers of alcohol. It wasn't really meant to, put forward a science-based understanding.
That's right.
Which is frustrating, right? The media should at least pretend to do that. Like, here's
doesn't get you clicks though.
I know, but I don't care. I'm so fed up with that excuse.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know what else is there to say. Like, you're not going to die. Be sensible. If drinking is a problem for you, don't drink. There's all kinds of ways all kinds of methods and ways people will help you quit drinking. But I don't know. This whole label thing is ridiculous. And you're right, by the way, because I smoked for just a few years, thankfully. Mm-hmm. But I loved every single cigarette. It was so wonderful. I would wake up in the morning and I'd take a pack of cigarettes and a giant
cup of coffee.
Just a giant freaking, I don't even know what to call it, like a vase full of coffee. And whatever book I was reading, I'd sit on my front porch and I would chain smoke. I would drink coffee and I would read. And it was like just a little slice of heaven.
It was like nirvana.
It was like nicotine and caffeine are just beautiful chemicals. They go together so well. Now I stopped because I found a safe alternative in nicotine products that don't require tobacco combustion.
I use nicotine gum to quit. So I think nicotine products that replace nicotine are a great way to quit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in other words, people change their habits when they start to experience the consequences of their actions, or you give them a viable alternative.
Yep.
And in the case of alcohol, this is not, for one thing, most people that drink don't get cancer.
Yep.
It's so, I don't know, just relax, everyone. Just relax.
Yeah.
Take a breath. Nobody gets out alive, as Liza said last week.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So you might as well stop and smell the roses along the way.
Yeah. And be sensible. Just moderate your behavior,
That's right.
All is to it. Well, I'm glad we could solve all your problems this week. Thank you for joining us. Bring your problems to us. We solve them in 47 minutes or less.
There you go.
Follow us on social media. It's at Dr. Liza MD. I'm at CamJ English. Spaces are every Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time. We talk about everything from opioids to designer babies to climate change to agriculture, anything and everything.
It's fun. Yeah.
It's a great time. We get a lot of people showing up with different perspectives. And there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. There's some value in it. So join us. If you have a suggestion for a topic,
we'd love to hear it.
We're always looking for speakers.
Yep.
So please come. Thank you for joining us on the show. As always, we will see you next week.
Ciao.